The courtroom was packed that morning, the air thick with murmurs and whispers. Wooden benches creaked as people leaned forward, curious about the strange rumor they had heard, that a child would be speaking in court today. Most thought it was some kind of mistake. Others came simply to see what kind of spectacle it would be. The door opened quietly, and in walked a woman in worn clothes holding the hand of a small boy. The mother's eyes were tired, dark circles beneath them betraying sleepless nights. Her son, though, looked straight ahead, nervous but firm. He was just 9 years old, but there was something unusual about the way he carried himself. When they reached the front, the judge adjusted his glasses. "Mrs. Johnson," he said kindly, "is this your son?" Before she could answer, the boy spoke up. "Yes, Your Honor. My name is Caleb Johnson. And I'm here to defend my mom." A burst of laughter filled the room. Lawyers chuckled. Some of the audience even clapped mockingly. The opposing counsel shook his head, grinning. "Your Honor," he said sarcastically, "are we really doing this today? This is a court of law, not a talent show." Caleb's mother's face turned red with embarrassment. She leaned down and whispered, "Baby, please sit down. Let's just talk to the judge quietly." But Caleb shook his head. His voice trembled, but there was strength behind it. "No, Mom. You said truth always wins if someone's brave enough to tell it." His words cut through the laughter like a blade. The room grew still for a moment. The judge studied the boy's face, noticing how his hands were shaking but his eyes didn't waver. There was no mischief, no playfulness, only courage and pain. "Son," the judge said slowly, "do you understand what you're saying? This is a legal proceeding. It's not a game." "Yes, sir," Caleb said. "But it's not a game for us either. My mom didn't do anything wrong, and nobody wants to listen to her. So I will." The judge exchanged a look with the court clerk. The laughter in the room had faded into silence now. Even the lawyer who had been smirking moments earlier looked slightly uncomfortable. Caleb placed a folder on the table, worn, creased, and held together with tape. Inside were documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. The boy looked at the folder as though it were a sword, the only weapon he had to protect his mother. From the back row, someone whispered, "What's he doing?" No one answered. Everyone was watching. The judge sighed, tapping his pen. "All right, Caleb," he said after a pause. "You can stay standing. Let's see what this is about." Ruth Johnson, Caleb's mother, wiped her eyes. She wanted to stop him, to pull him close and hide him from the ridicule. But deep down, a small part of her felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Caleb took a deep breath. His voice quivered slightly as he said, "My mom worked hard for everything we have. She didn't break any laws. She just wants to keep our home." Every pair of eyes was on him now. There was no laughter. No whispering. Only the faint hum of the ceiling fan above them and the sound of his tiny voice echoing through the courtroom. No one knew yet that this trembling child, standing in oversized shoes and a faded shirt, was about to do something no one expected. The laughter that began the hearing would soon be replaced by stunned silence, as a 9-year-old boy would remind an entire courtroom what justice truly meant. Ruth Johnson's life had never been easy. Every wrinkle on her face told a story, of survival, of sacrifice, of love. She was the kind of woman who never complained, even when life seemed determined to break her. For years, Ruth worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over her son's head. Every morning, before the sun even rose, she would lace up her worn sneakers, kiss Caleb on the forehead, and whisper, "Be good today, baby." Then she'd hurry off to the diner, where she served coffee with a tired smile. In the afternoons, she cleaned offices, scrubbing floors, wiping desks, and emptying bins for people who never even looked at her. By night, when her body begged for rest, she washed clothes for neighbors to earn a few extra dollars. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her hands were always sore, her back always aching, but whenever she looked at Caleb, her reason for living, she'd find strength again. One day, she would tell him, all this hard work will be worth it. But then came Mr. Givens, her landlord, a wealthy, arrogant man who owned half the neighborhood. He never liked Ruth. Maybe it was because she was a single black mother. Maybe because she spoke up when things were unfair. Or maybe simply because she refused to be intimidated by him. At first, it was small things. He'd forget to fix the leaking roof or the broken heater. Then he started visiting unannounced, inspecting the apartment and muttering insults under his breath. Ruth endured it all quietly, just wanting peace. But when the city announced rent control policies, Mr. Givens saw an opportunity to make more money, by forcing his old tenants out. A month later, Ruth received a letter. It was cold, formal, and cruel: notice of eviction, non-payment and property damage. Ruth's hands trembled as she read it. This must be a mistake, she whispered. She had never missed a payment in her life. Every dollar she earned went straight to keeping that small apartment. She searched through her drawer and found her receipts, all neatly folded, proof that she had paid every month. She marched to Mr. Givens' office the next day. "Sir, there's been an error. I've paid you every month," she said softly, handing him the receipts. He glanced at them briefly, smirked, and said, "You can wave those papers all you want, Ms. Johnson. The court will decide. I need that apartment vacated." Her heart sank. She couldn't afford a lawyer, she barely earned enough to pay bills. When she called the local legal aid office, they apologized, saying they had too many pending cases. Ruth sat at her kitchen table, staring at the eviction notice. Tears streamed down her face, dripping onto the paper. Caleb came running from his room. "Mom, what's wrong?" She quickly wiped her tears and forced a smile. "It's nothing, baby. Just some adult stuff." But he could see through her. He'd seen her exhaustion, the nights she came home limping, the mornings she hid her tears. That night, while she thought he was asleep, Caleb overheard her whispering a prayer, her voice breaking, "Lord, please don't let them take our home. It's all we have." Something shifted inside him that night. He stared at the ceiling, fists clenched. There had to be a way. Ruth didn't know it yet, but her son, that quiet, observant little boy who watched everything, was already planning to do something extraordinary, because in a world that kept telling his mother she was powerless, Caleb refused to believe it. He would do whatever it took to make sure no one, not even a rich landlord, could take away the only safe place they had left. Caleb Johnson was only 9 years old, but he had seen more struggle than most adults ever would. He'd watched his mom come home exhausted, with cracked hands and sore feet, yet still smile at him like everything was fine. But this time, something was different. The eviction notice had taken that light from her eyes. That night, while his mother sat silently on the couch, staring at the stack of bills, Caleb made a decision. He was just a boy, no power, no money, no voice, but he wasn't going to let his mom fight alone. He crept into his small room and sat at the edge of his bed. The glow of his school tablet lit up his face as he typed, "How to help your mom in court." He didn't even know what he was looking for, but he was desperate. The search results flooded the screen: articles about legal rights, courtroom videos, even blogs written by lawyers. He clicked on every single one. Words like tenant rights, eviction laws, and evidence flashed before him. He didn't understand them at first, but he kept reading. The more he read, the more determined he became. Every night, after finishing his homework, Caleb studied legal terms. He wrote notes on sticky papers and stuck them all over his wall: burden of proof, cross-examination, objection sustained. He even practiced saying them out loud, mimicking what he'd seen on YouTube videos of courtrooms. At school, while his classmates played football or traded snacks, Caleb sat under a tree, reading articles about housing laws. The teachers thought he was just shy. They didn't know he was preparing to stand up against a system that had already given up on people like his mom. One afternoon, while at the library, Caleb's quiet determination caught someone's attention: a retired lawyer named Mr. Thomas. He was an older man with kind eyes and a gray beard, spending his retirement reading law journals and helping the librarian organize legal books that he noticed the boy flipping through a thick law textbook, barely able to lift it. "That's a pretty heavy read for someone your age," Mr. Thomas said with a chuckle. Caleb looked up, nervous. "I'm trying to learn about court." "Court?" the old man asked, raising an eyebrow. "Planning to be a lawyer someday?" Caleb hesitated, then whispered, "I need to help my mom. She's in trouble. We don't have a lawyer." Mr. Thomas frowned, his curiosity turning into concern. He asked Caleb to explain, and as the boy spoke, about the eviction, about his mother's innocence, and about the landlord's lies, the old man's heart broke a little. When Caleb finished, Mr. Thomas leaned back and said softly, "Son, you've got courage. Real courage. But the law isn't easy. It takes patience, preparation, and truth." Caleb nodded, his small face full of determination. "Then teach me." From that day forward, Mr. Thomas became Caleb's quiet mentor. Every evening, he'd meet the boy at the library and help him understand legal basics, what a witness was, how to present evidence, how to stay calm even when others tried to intimidate him. Together, they built a plan. Mr. Thomas helped Caleb organize his mother's rent receipts, photographs of the apartment, and written statements from neighbors. Caleb even created a folder titled Mom's Case. When Ruth asked what he was doing, Caleb simply smiled and said, "Just homework, Mom." But this was more than homework, this was a mission. Each night, as he closed his books, he whispered to himself, "I'll make them listen." He didn't have a suit or a lawyer's badge, but he had something more powerful: love. Love for his mother, for her sacrifices, and for the truth that no one else seemed to care about. And though the world saw just a child, Caleb was preparing for something much bigger, a battle for justice that would soon make an entire courtroom fall silent. The days that followed were filled with tension and quiet determination inside the Johnson home. Their tiny apartment, usually filled with the smell of Ruth's homemade cornbread, now smelled of paper, ink, and stress. Every corner of their worn kitchen table was covered with documents, receipts, and handwritten notes. Ruth tried to stay strong, but fear haunted her eyes. "Caleb," she said one evening, "we don't stand a chance. They have lawyers, suits, and money. We only have the truth." Caleb looked up from his notes, his small face serious beyond his years. "Then that's all we need, Mom," he replied softly. "Truth is louder than lies." He spoke with such certainty that for a moment, Ruth didn't know whether to laugh or cry. This was her baby, the boy who used to fall asleep clutching his teddy bear, now speaking like a man preparing for war. Every evening after dinner, Caleb and his new mentor, Mr. Thomas, met at the library or over the phone. The retired lawyer guided him through the legal maze, explaining what evidence really meant, how to structure an argument, and how to speak clearly in front of authority. "Facts win cases, Caleb," Mr. Thomas told him one night. "Not emotions. Bring proof, stay calm, and never raise your voice, even when they try to make you small." So Caleb prepared. He spent hours sorting through every rent receipt his mother had saved. He placed them neatly in date order, highlighting the payments in yellow. He printed screenshots of text messages where Mr. Givens, the landlord, had acknowledged receiving rent. He even took pictures of their apartment, proof that they hadn't damaged a single thing. As the landlord had claimed, when he wasn't organizing evidence, he practiced. Standing in front of the mirror, wearing his school uniform, he pretended to be in court. "Your Honor," he said, mimicking the tone he'd heard in videos. "My mom isn't a criminal. She's just being treated unfairly." He would pause, study his reflection, and then correct himself, "No, that sounds too angry. Try calm. Calm but firm." Ruth often watched from the doorway, silent tears in her eyes. Every word he spoke felt like a prayer, a child's desperate attempt to fix the injustice the world had thrown at them. Sometimes, Caleb would fall asleep over his notes, his head resting on the papers. Ruth would gently cover him with a blanket, whispering, "You shouldn't have to carry this, baby." But Caleb wanted to. He needed to. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't just about rent, it was about dignity. About showing the world that people like his mom mattered. As the court date drew closer, Ruth's anxiety grew. She considered not going, afraid they would humiliate her in front of everyone. "Maybe I should just leave," she said one night. "We can find another place." Caleb looked up sharply. "No, Mom. That's what he wants. If we leave, he wins." His voice cracked slightly, but his eyes burned with conviction. "You told me never to run from what's right." Ruth stared at her son, speechless. Somewhere along the way, this little boy had become her strength. The night before the trial, the apartment was silent. Caleb sat by the window, holding the folder he had prepared, the folder that held every piece of truth they owned. The moonlight glowed on his determined face that he whispered to himself, "We're going to be okay, Mom. I promise." Ruth came up behind him, placing her hand on his shoulder. "You're my hero, Caleb," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "No, Mom. You're mine." When morning came, Caleb dressed neatly in his best shirt, the one with the tiny rip near the collar. He polished his shoes and combed his hair carefully. In his small hands, he clutched the evidence folder like it was a shield. The courtroom awaited. The battle was about to begin. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray, the kind of morning that made everything feel heavier than it already was. The courthouse loomed like a giant stone fortress, intimidating even for adults, let alone a 9-year-old boy and his mother. Ruth gripped Caleb's hand tightly as they climbed the wide marble steps. Her heart pounded in her chest. She'd barely slept all night, haunted by fears of humiliation and loss. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice trembling, "if anything goes wrong, promise me you'll stay calm." He looked up at her, his eyes calm and steady. "It won't go wrong, Mom. We have the truth." Inside, the courtroom buzzed with chatter. The benches were filled, tenants who'd suffered similar fates, curious onlookers, and even a few reporters who'd caught wind of the child defender. It was rare to see a child in court for anything other than a school tour, and rarer still to see one clutching legal papers like a professional. When Ruth and Caleb entered, the whispers began. "Is that the boy? He's really going to talk." "This is ridiculous." Mr. Givens sat smugly on the plaintiff's side, his expensive suit pressed to perfection. His lawyer, a tall man with slick hair and a confident smirk, leaned in and whispered something that made Givens chuckle. They didn't see Caleb as a threat, just a source of entertainment. The judge entered, and everyone stood. The room fell silent as he took his seat, adjusting his glasses and scanning the courtroom. "This is case number 2184, Givens vs. Johnson," he announced. "Are both parties present?" "Yes, Your Honor," the opposing lawyer said smoothly. "The landlord is present, and the defendant as well." He paused, then added with a mocking tone, "Along with her assistant, I suppose?" Soft laughter rippled through the room. Ruth's cheeks flushed, and she tried to pull Caleb down to sit beside her, whispering, "Just let me handle this, baby." But Caleb didn't move. He stood up, holding the folder close to his chest, his little chin raised. "Your Honor," he said clearly, though his voice wavered at first, "I'm Caleb Johnson. I'm here to represent my mom." The judge blinked, momentarily stunned. Then, a few scattered laughs echoed again from the benches. Even the court clerk looked up in surprise. "Son," the judge began carefully, "you do understand that this is a legal proceeding, correct? You're not required to speak." Caleb nodded. "Yes, sir. But my mom can't afford a lawyer, and nobody wanted to take our case. I just want to show the truth. Please." The courtroom fell quiet. The boy's sincerity hung heavy in the air. The judge studied him for a moment. This wasn't arrogance or playfulness. This was desperation mixed with courage. Finally, the judge leaned back in his chair. Very well, he said slowly. You may speak. But remember, young man, this court deals in facts, not feelings. Yes, Your Honor, Caleb said softly, and sat beside his mother, who was fighting back tears. The opposing lawyer stood, clearly amused. Your Honor, with all due respect, are we really allowing a child to argue a case? The judge's gaze hardened. I said he may speak. Now proceed. The lawyer sighed dramatically and began presenting his argument, full of legal jargon and polished phrases. He painted Ruth as a careless tenant who refused to pay rent, who damaged property, and ignored repeated notices. Each word stabbed at Ruth's heart like a blade, but Caleb didn't flinch. He quietly opened his folder, flipping through pages as if he had done it 1,000 times before. When the lawyer finished, smirking confidently, the judge turned to Caleb. All right, young man. You may respond. Caleb stood up. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice carried across the silent room. Your Honor, what he said isn't true. My mom worked hard to pay every month. I have proof. He lifted the first page, a series of receipts. These are all the payments she made, signed by Mr. Givens himself. I also have text messages where he confirmed receiving rent. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Givens' smug smile faded, and Caleb continued, pulling out a small voice recorder. I have this. My mom recorded Mr. Givens saying he wanted us out so he could raise the rent. Gasps erupted in the courtroom. The lawyer's face went pale. The judge held up his hand for silence. We'll review that evidence shortly, he said. Ruth gripped Caleb's arm, whispering through tears, You did it, baby. You really did it. But Caleb wasn't celebrating yet. He knew this was only the beginning. The courtroom that had laughed at him was now dead silent, and for the first time, even the judge looked impressed. The little boy who was supposed to be a joke had just turned the entire case upside down. The entire courtroom sat frozen, eyes fixed on the little boy who dared to challenge the system. Caleb stood in front of the judge, clutching his folder like it was the most precious thing in the world. His voice trembled slightly, but his gaze was unwavering. He wasn't just speaking for his mother, he was speaking for every person who had ever been treated unfairly because they were poor or powerless. Your Honor, he began, taking a slow breath, my mom isn't a criminal. She's not someone who breaks things or refuses to pay. She's the hardest worker I know. A few people in the courtroom exchanged glances. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, curious. Caleb opened the folder and laid out his evidence one piece at a time. Here are the receipts for every month she paid rent, he said, his small fingers carefully spreading them on the table. January, February, March, all signed by Mr. Givens. The judge picked up one of the receipts and examined it closely. The landlord's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. Your Honor, those could be, but Caleb interrupted politely, they're real, sir. You can match the signatures to his own on the lease papers. The lawyer frowned, visibly irritated, then Caleb held up his tablet. These are text messages my mom sent to Mr. Givens. Here, he says, got your payment, Ruth. Thank you. That's from his number. The courtroom murmured again. The judge turned to the lawyer. Do you have any evidence to the contrary? The man stammered. Well, Your Honor, it's possible those messages were, enough speculation, the judge said firmly. We'll let the evidence speak. Ruth sat quietly beside her son, tears glistening in her eyes. She couldn't believe what she was witnessing. Her little boy, the same child who used to struggle with his multiplication tables, was standing before a courtroom full of adults, defending her with the poise of someone far beyond his years. But Caleb wasn't done yet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small recorder. There's one more thing, he said. His voice softened, but the room was so quiet that everyone could hear him clearly. This is a recording of Mr. Givens telling another tenant he wants us gone so he can raise the rent. I can play it, Your Honor. The judge nodded slowly. Proceed. Caleb pressed play. The static-filled audio echoed through the courtroom. Then came the unmistakable voice of Mr. Givens, "That single mother's been there too long. Once she's out, I can bring in someone who'll pay double." The reaction was immediate. Gasps, whispers, even a few angry shouts erupted from the crowd. Mr. Givens' lawyer turned pale, fumbling with his papers. The landlord himself tried to stand up, stammering, That's not me. It's doctored." The judge banged his gavel. "Order. Sit down, Mr. Givens." He turned back to Caleb. "Son, where did you get this recording?" Caleb looked over at his mother before answering. "My mom recorded it by accident. She was talking to another neighbor when Mr. Givens came by yelling outside the door. She didn't even know it captured him saying that until I listened." The judge nodded again, expression unreadable, but his eyes had softened. "You've done well, Caleb. You've presented your evidence clearly and with respect." Caleb bowed his head slightly. "Thank you, Your Honor. I just want my mom to be treated fairly. We're not asking for anything special. Just fairness." For a moment, no one spoke. The courtroom was utterly still, the kind of silence that carries weight, meaning, and emotion. Even those who had laughed earlier now looked at the boy with admiration and guilt. Ruth couldn't hold back anymore. She covered her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her son had just done what grown men with college degrees often fail to do. He made people listen. The judge finally spoke, his voice gentle. "Mrs. Johnson, you have a remarkable son." Ruth reached over and squeezed Caleb's hand. "No, Your Honor," she whispered, smiling through her tears. "I have a brave one." As Caleb sat back down, his heart raced. He didn't know if they had won yet, but for the first time, he saw something on the judge's face that gave him hope, respect. The same people who had mocked him hours ago now looked at him in awe. The laughter that had once echoed through that courtroom had turned into something else entirely: silence, admiration, and maybe even shame, because a child had done what the system refused to: speak the truth. The judge leaned back in his chair, eyes shifting between Caleb and the stunned landlord. "Mr. Givens," he said sternly, "you've just heard a recording where someone who sounds very much like you admits to manipulating this tenant's rent situation. Do you deny it?" Mr. Givens, sweating through his expensive suit, forced a weak chuckle. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The boy is 9 years old, 9. Are we really taking a child's evidence seriously?" The judge's eyes narrowed. "We take truth seriously, regardless of who brings it." The tension in the courtroom thickened. The lawyer for Mr. Givens stood quickly, trying to regain control. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this so-called recording could easily have been edited. And this boy," he said, gesturing toward Caleb with condescension, "has no legal training. He can't even testify properly without guidance." Caleb's mother clenched her hands, but Caleb gently touched her arm, silently asking her to stay calm. He took a deep breath and stepped forward again, his small voice steady yet sharp. "I may not be a lawyer," he said, "but I know when someone is lying. My mom always says the truth doesn't need a fancy suit to be real." A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom. Even the bailiff's stern expression softened for a moment. Caleb turned to the lawyer. "Sir, if you think the recording is fake, you can have the phone checked. I brought it with me. It's not edited, it's right here." The lawyer blinked, momentarily thrown off. "You have the original file?" "Yes, sir," Caleb said, holding up the phone. "And it's got the timestamp, too. The same day Mr. Givens gave my mom an eviction notice." The lawyer hesitated, realizing that fighting the evidence would only make them look worse. But before he could respond, Caleb added, "Also, the same words he said on the recording? He used them again to Mrs. Rodriguez, our neighbor. She's here today. She can tell the truth, too. At that, a woman in the audience stood. It was Mrs. Rodriguez, a kind elderly lady who had watched Ruth struggle for years. "It's true, Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "He told me himself he was raising rent and wanted Ruth out. He said she was too poor to keep up." Gasps echoed again. The landlord turned red, mumbling angrily. The judge turned sharply to him. "Is that true, Mr. Givens?" Mr. Givens stuttered. I may have said something similar, but, so you admit to targeting this tenant?" "No, I didn't." "Enough," the judge snapped, slamming his gavel. "You've been inconsistent since this hearing began. The child has presented organized, factual evidence, more coherent than anything your counsel has produced." Caleb watched quietly, his heart racing. He didn't fully understand all the legal terms, but he could tell something was changing. For the first time, the judge wasn't looking at him like a joke. He was looking at him like someone who mattered. The landlord's lawyer tried to salvage what was left. "Your Honor, even if there was some misunderstanding, it doesn't change the fact that the rent was late." Caleb quickly stepped forward again. "That's not true. We paid every month. And even if one payment came a few days late, it's because my mom's paycheck was delayed by her job. But we always made it right after. She never refused to pay." Ruth, sitting quietly behind him, whispered through tears, "That's my boy." The judge looked thoughtful, tapping his pen against the desk. "Mr. Givens," he said at last, "this case has revealed more than a rent dispute. It's shown prejudice, dishonesty, and greed. The law is not here to serve those who manipulate it for profit." Caleb's small hands trembled as he stood there, unsure what would come next. He had done everything he could, shown the receipts, the messages, the recording, and even witnesses. Now, it was out of his hands. The judge turned toward him and said gently, "Caleb, you've done an extraordinary job today. Most adults wouldn't have had your courage." The courtroom filled with a heavy silence again, but this time, it wasn't laughter or disbelief. It was respect. The landlord slumped into his chair, defeated, while Caleb's mother reached for her son's hand. "You did it, sweetheart," she whispered. "No matter what happens, I'm so proud of you." Caleb smiled faintly, looking up at her. "I just wanted them to listen, Mom." And for the first time since the case began, they finally did. The courtroom was silent. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes every breath feel heavy. Caleb sat beside his mother, his small hands still clutching the edge of the table. He had done everything he could, now all that remained was to wait. Judge Thompson removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose as he glanced through the pile of documents and evidence spread before him. Everyone watched him, the landlord nervously fidgeting, the lawyer whispering under his breath, and Ruth holding her son's hand tightly. Finally, the judge spoke. His deep, steady voice filled the room. "I have reviewed the evidence presented, including the receipts, text messages, and the audio recording. I have also listened to the testimonies provided by witnesses." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "At first, I'll admit, I was skeptical. A 9-year-old representing his mother in court? It seemed unusual, even unthinkable. But after hearing this young man speak, I can say without hesitation, I was wrong." A ripple of emotion swept through the courtroom. Caleb blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Judge Thompson continued, "The facts are clear. The landlord, Mr. Givens, knowingly accepted rent payments and then attempted to evict Mrs. Johnson under false claims of non-payment. Furthermore, the recording confirms his intent to remove her for financial gain, which constitutes unlawful eviction and discrimination." Mr. Givens shot to his feet. "That's ridiculous. You can't." The judge slammed his gavel down. "Sit down." His voice thundered through the room, silencing everyone. He turned to Ruth and Caleb. "Mrs. Johnson, your tenancy is hereby protected. The eviction notice is null and void." Furthermore, Mr. Givens will be fined for falsifying housing documents and attempting to exploit his tenant." Ruth gasped, covering her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Caleb looked up at her, confusion turning into pure joy. We won, Mom." She nodded, trembling. "Yes, baby. We won." But the judge wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Caleb. "And as for you, young man, Caleb Johnson, I've presided over this court for nearly 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what I witnessed today." The crowd leaned in, every person listening intently. "You stood in a room full of adults who doubted you," the judge said, his tone softening, "and you spoke with intelligence, courage, and respect. You reminded everyone here what justice truly means, not power, not money, but truth." Caleb swallowed hard, tears threatening to spill. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge smiled faintly. "I believe you have a very bright future ahead. Perhaps, one day, you'll be sitting where I am." A few people chuckled softly, but it wasn't mockery this time, it was admiration. The same people who had laughed when Caleb first stood up now clapped quietly, nodding in respect. Even the bailiff, a stoic man who rarely showed emotion, cracked a small smile. "Well done, son," he whispered under his breath. "Mr. Givens sat back down, defeated. His lawyer packed up the files, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The courtroom that had once echoed with laughter now radiated something entirely different: pride, hope, and awe. Ruth turned to her son, pulling him into her arms. "You saved us," she whispered through tears. "My little boy saved us." Caleb hugged her tightly, his small frame shaking from relief. "I just didn't want you to cry anymore, Mom." The judge rose from his seat, gathering his papers. "Court is adjourned," he declared. "And Mrs. Johnson, I wish you and your son all the best. You've both taught this courtroom something valuable today." As people began to leave, a few approached Ruth and Caleb, offering handshakes and smiles. One woman even said, "That boy's going places. You must be so proud." Ruth smiled weakly. "More than words can say." Caleb glanced around the room, the once hostile faces now warm, respectful. He had walked in as a scared little boy and was walking out as something else entirely, a voice that had been heard. As they stepped outside into the sunlight, Ruth knelt in front of him and cupped his face. "You're my hero, Caleb. Always remember that." He smiled shyly. "You're my hero too, Mom." They held hands as they walked away from the courthouse, not as victims of the system, but as victors of truth, and behind them, the echo of the judge's final words seemed to linger in the air. Sometimes, the smallest voices carry the greatest power. News of the courtroom miracle spread faster than anyone could have imagined. What began as a small local hearing in a dusty courtroom quickly turned into a headline that caught the attention of the entire city, and soon, the entire country. 9-year-old defends his mother in court, and wins, read the first newspaper headline. By the next morning, reporters were outside the small apartment building where Ruth and Caleb lived. Cameras flashed, microphones pointed toward them as neighbors peeked out of their windows, whispering in awe. For years, the Johnsons had been invisible, just another struggling family trying to survive. But now, everyone wanted to hear their story. Caleb stood beside his mother, a little nervous but still polite as reporters asked him questions. "Caleb, how did you learn so much about the law?" one woman asked. He smiled shyly. "I just read a lot. I watched videos about how courts work, and I wanted to help my mom. She always helps me, so I thought it was my turn." His simple answer melted hearts everywhere. When the clip aired on television that evening, viewers across the country were stunned. A child, standing up in front of adults, using knowledge and truth to fight injustice, it was something people didn't see every day. Social media exploded with messages of support. "This boy is a hero. Someone get Caleb a scholarship, this kid's going to change the world. This story restored my faith in humanity." Within days, their mailbox overflowed with letters, strangers sending gifts, notes of encouragement, and offers to help. Some were from single mothers who said Caleb's courage gave them hope to stand up for themselves. Others were from lawyers and judges who wanted to meet the boy who reminded them why they chose justice in the first place. One letter stood out. It was written on official letterhead from a prestigious law school. The dean wrote, "When Caleb is ready for college, his tuition will be fully covered here. We believe in nurturing brilliance wherever it's found, even if it shines early." Ruth read the letter aloud, tears streaming down her face. "Caleb, they want to give you a scholarship. Can you believe that?" He looked up from his notebook, eyes wide. "Really? But I'm only 9. She laughed through her tears. "Maybe so. But apparently, you've already impressed the grown-ups." The community, once quiet and divided, began to change too. Neighbors who barely spoke before now came together to help one another. Mrs. Rodriguez started a small, tenant rights group, inspired by what she witnessed in court. "If a 9-year-old can learn the law," she said proudly, "then so can we." Even the judge, moved by the experience, invited Caleb and his mother to speak at a youth event about standing up for what's right. Caleb stood on the stage, his voice shy but confident. "I was scared," he said. "But I remembered something my mom always tells me: the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. So, I told the truth." The crowd erupted in applause. Some people had tears in their eyes. For Ruth, life slowly began to change. She received a better job offer from a local law office that had seen the story, and they even helped her relocate to a safer neighborhood. For the first time in years, she could breathe without fear of eviction or harassment. At night, when the world quieted down, Ruth would still peek into Caleb's room. He'd be there, sitting cross-legged on his bed, reading about famous lawyers and landmark cases. "I want to help people who don't have anyone," he'd tell her. She'd smile, her heart full. "You already are, baby." One evening, as they sat on their balcony watching the sunset, Ruth whispered, "You know, Caleb, sometimes life tries to break us so it can see what we're made of." Caleb looked at her, puzzled. "And what are we made of, Mom?" She smiled. "Strength. And truth." He grinned. "Then we're going to be okay." And as the orange glow of the setting sun bathed them in warmth, it was clear, the laughter that once mocked them had turned into applause, the judgment into respect, and their pain into purpose. The world had witnessed something powerful, a reminder that courage doesn't depend on age, size, or status. Sometimes, it only takes a child's voice to remind the world what justice truly means. 10 years later, the same courthouse that once echoed with laughter and disbelief now stood quiet and dignified, sunlight streaming through its tall glass windows. But today, it was filled once more, with reporters, students, and community members waiting to witness a special ceremony. The banner outside read, "Honoring Caleb Johnson, youngest recipient of the Justice Youth Award." Now 19, Caleb walked through those courthouse doors again, taller, more confident, dressed in a crisp navy suit that made him look every bit the young man his mother always believed he would become. But even with the cameras flashing and people clapping, his eyes carried the same calm focus he had the day he stood there as a frightened little boy defending his mother. As he approached the podium, Ruth stood proudly in the front row, her eyes filled with tears. Her once tired face now glowed with joy. Life had changed for them in ways she never dreamed possible. After that day in court, doors had opened, opportunities, scholarships, and most importantly, peace. Caleb had grown up knowing that justice wasn't just a word in a book, it was something you had to fight for, even when your voice trembled. The crowd quieted as Caleb adjusted the microphone. His deep, mature voice carried across the hall, steady, yet full of emotion. "I still remember standing here," he began. "I was 9 years old. My legs were shaking. People laughed when they saw me. But I wasn't there to impress anyone, I was there because my mom needed help. And I couldn't stand to see her treated unfairly." He paused, looking around the room. "That day taught me something powerful. you don't have to be big to make a difference. You just have to be brave enough to speak up. Applause erupted, but Caleb lifted a hand gently. But this isn't just about me. It's about my mom, Ruth Johnson. The woman who worked 3 jobs, went hungry some nights so I could eat, and taught me that truth is stronger than fear. She's the real hero of this story. Ruth covered her mouth, crying silently as the audience rose to their feet, giving her a standing ovation. Caleb smiled at her, his eyes glistening. After the ceremony, a group of young students approached him, kids who had watched his story in school. One little girl tugged at his sleeve shyly. "Mr. Caleb," she said, "I want to be a lawyer like you when I grow up." He knelt to her level and smiled. "Then promise me something," he said softly. "Promise me you'll never be afraid to stand up for what's right, even if you're the only one standing." The girl nodded seriously. "I promise." Years had passed, but Caleb's story continued to ripple outward. He had started a foundation called the Truth Project, offering free legal guidance and scholarships for families facing wrongful evictions and discrimination. He didn't just fight for justice, he made sure others had the tools to do it too. In interviews, Caleb often said, "The law isn't just for the powerful, it's for everyone. My mother taught me that fairness isn't something you beg for. It's something you stand up for." One day, a journalist asked him, "Do you ever think back to that moment when people laughed at you?" He smiled thoughtfully. "I do," he said. "But I don't hear the laughter anymore. I hear my mother's voice telling me, speak the truth, no matter who's listening. And that's the sound that stays with me." That evening, Caleb and Ruth visited the old neighborhood. The building where they once lived had been renovated. The streets were cleaner, brighter. As they walked hand in hand, neighbors waved and called out his name. Mrs. Rodriguez, older but still lively, came out of her doorway. "Look at you, Caleb. You turned out just like I said, a lawyer with a good heart." Caleb laughed. "You always believed in me." She winked. "Some of us didn't need proof, sweetheart. We saw the fire in you long before the world did." As the sun dipped low, Ruth looked up at her son, the boy who had once been small enough to hide behind her skirt, now towering beside her, strong and compassionate. "You've made me proud every single day," she said softly. Caleb put his arm around her shoulders. "You're the reason I could." They stood there in the golden light, the sounds of laughter and life echoing through the streets that once knew only struggle, and in that quiet, glowing moment, it was clear, the story that began with humiliation had become a legend, not because a child won a court case, but because he proved that even the smallest voice can echo loud enough to change the world.